The sun rose over the New York skyline as Flight 293 prepared for its long journey to Nice, France. In the quiet hum of the first-class cabin, Gabriel Sinclair adjusted his seat, the soft leather molding to his form. The 38-year-old billionaire was no stranger to flights like this, routine stops on a path paved with hard work and ambition. But for all his success, Gabriel preferred to travel without fanfare. His tailored navy suit and understated gold watch were a subtle nod to his achievements, not a declaration of them. Gabriel's story began in a small neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, where opportunities often felt like distant dreams. His parents had instilled in him a relentless work ethic, teaching him to rise above the limitations society often placed on men who looked like him. Decades later, he had built an empire in luxury real estate that spanned continents. Yet he carried those early lessons with him. This flight was meant to be another step forward. Gabriel was on his way to finalize the acquisition of a historic property in Monaco, a deal that would cement his reputation as one of the sharpest minds in his industry. As he reviewed the details of the transaction on his tablet, murmurs rippled through the cabin. Some passengers recognized him, their whispers a mix of admiration and curiosity. Gabriel noticed but didn't react. Attention, whether positive or otherwise, was something he had learned to endure with quiet grace. The cabin was still settling into the rhythm of the flight when the first sign of tension appeared. A flight attendant approached Gabriel's seat. Her uniform was immaculate, her platinum blonde hair pulled tightly into a bun. Her name tag read, Claudia, and her smile, at least at first glance, seemed practiced but polite. "Sir," she began, her voice firm but not overtly rude. "You'll need to turn off your tablet. It's interfering with the plane's equipment." Gabriel looked up, his expression calm. "We're at cruising altitude," he said evenly. "I was under the impression this was allowed. But if it's an issue, I'll turn it off." Claudia's smile faltered, her tone sharpening. "Rules are rules, Mr. Sinclair." Gabriel paused briefly, then powered off the device without further comment. As she turned to leave, he noticed her exchanging a glance with another attendant. There was something in her demeanor, not overt, but present nonetheless, that struck him as odd. He dismissed the thought and returned his focus to the steady hum of the plane, reminding himself that not every moment was worth dissecting. Yet, the undercurrent of tension lingered. During the dinner service, Claudia placed trays in front of the other passengers with precision and care. When she reached Gabriel, however, the tray landed with a clatter, the contents shifting precariously. A splash of red wine sloshed onto his lap. "I'm so sorry," she said, her tone hollow. The apology delivered more out of obligation than sincerity. "It's all right," Gabriel replied, dabbing at the stain with a napkin. His voice was measured, but the stares of nearby passengers told a different story. They had seen it too, the careless way the tray was handled, the fleeting look on Claudia's face. The cabin grew quieter as the flight progressed. But Gabriel felt the weight of unspoken tension. Moments like these weren't new to him. For all his success, his presence in certain spaces, elite ones especially, was often met with unease. Subtle or otherwise, it wasn't the overt hostility of his youth, the kind that called you names and chased you out of rooms. It was quieter now, harder to name but no less real. A clumsy service, a clipped tone, a rule enforced with unnecessary vigor. It was the kind of prejudice that came wrapped in plausible deniability. As Gabriel folded the napkin on his tray, he noticed a fellow passenger, a woman seated across the aisle, watching him with a concerned expression. When their eyes met, she quickly looked away. People always looked away, he thought. It was easier that way. The flight continued, and Gabriel shifted his gaze to the window, watching the endless blue sky stretch beyond the horizon. There was no sign yet of the turbulence ahead, but he felt it, a sense that the calm wouldn't last. It never did. The quiet hum of the engines had become a steady backdrop as Flight 293 cruised over the Atlantic. Passengers in first class had settled into their routines, some napping, others engrossed in books or movies. Gabriel Sinclair remained in his seat, flipping through notes on the upcoming acquisition. The dim cabin lights cast a soft glow over the polished surfaces and muted luxury of the space. But beneath that exterior, a sense of unease lingered. Claudia passed by again, her expression neutral yet her movements deliberate, her posture stiff. Gabriel noticed her eyes glance at him briefly before darting away, as though avoiding something too complicated to confront. He turned back to his notes, choosing not to engage. His years of navigating rooms where he wasn't expected or welcomed had taught him the value of composure. But even as he focused on the numbers and logistics in front of him, a part of his mind remained alert, like a radar sensing subtle shifts in the atmosphere. It was during the next service that the tension began to take a more visible shape. Claudia returned with the drink cart, her demeanor professional, though her gestures carried an edge of impatience. She stopped at each row, pouring glasses with practiced efficiency, her tone light and pleasant. When she reached Gabriel, the pleasantness disappeared, replaced by something clipped and almost curt. "Would you like anything, Mr. Sinclair?" she asked. Her words polite but her voice lacking warmth. "Water would be fine," Gabriel replied, his tone steady. He made it a point to meet her gaze. Not challengingly, but firmly enough to remind her that he wasn't oblivious to the subtle shift in her demeanor. Claudia poured the water without a word, her hand unsteady enough for a few drops to spill onto the napkin she placed beside him. She quickly moved on, not offering the small apologies she'd extended to others for lesser inconveniences. Gabriel watched her for a moment, not out of anger but from a place of quiet observation. These small moments, seemingly inconsequential to those around him, carried a weight that was hard to explain. This wasn't about the water or the tone. It was about the invisible line drawn in the air between them. A line he hadn't drawn but could feel nonetheless. He had felt it countless times before in the way conversations would shift when he walked into certain rooms. In the glances exchanged by people who thought he wasn't looking. The feeling wasn't new, but it was always present, waiting to remind him that success didn't erase perception. Dinner service followed, and Claudia's demeanor remained unchanged. Gabriel noticed the subtle ways her behavior differed when interacting with him compared to the other passengers. It wasn't something most people would catch, a tray placed with slightly more force. A fleeting look of annoyance where there had been politeness moments before. But Gabriel caught it. He always did. When Claudia placed his tray down with a loud clatter, the sound broke the soft murmur of the cabin. A few heads turned, startled by the noise, and Gabriel felt the weight of their gazes. Though no one said anything, he dabbed at his lap with the corner of his napkin, where the edge of the drink had spilled again. "I'm sorry," Claudia said, her voice devoid of sincerity. The words hung in the air, more an obligation than an offering. "It's fine," Gabriel replied evenly. The words weren't about forgiveness, they were a dismissal. An acknowledgement that pursuing the matter would accomplish little in a space like this. He returned to his meal. But the unease in the cabin had grown. The passengers around him had noticed too. They didn't speak up, people rarely did, but their glances said enough. A man seated 2 rows ahead turned back briefly, his brow furrowed in silent concern. A woman across the aisle gave Gabriel a fleeting look before focusing back on her book, though her page remained unturned for several minutes. Gabriel considered the silence of the cabin. It wasn't uncommon. People didn't like to involve themselves in moments of discomfort, especially when they couldn't name the source. These small infractions, layered one upon the other, weren't loud enough to draw intervention. They were quiet, deniable, and easy to ignore. For Gabriel, this was the reality of being in spaces where his presence still carried a quiet disruption. He had learned to navigate it without allowing it to define him. But he knew that didn't mean the burden disappeared. It only became something he carried differently. As the flight progressed, Gabriel leaned back in his seat, looking out at the expanse of sky stretching endlessly beyond the plane's wing. The horizon was serene, untouched by the turbulence of human behavior. Yet, inside the cabin, that same turbulence simmered, subtle but unmistakable. He closed his eyes briefly, not to ignore it but to collect himself. It was a skill he had perfected over the years. The ability to remain calm in the face of small provocations. To carry himself with dignity even when others did not. But even as he rested, Gabriel couldn't help but feel the weight of what had transpired, knowing it was far from over. The cabin had settled into a subdued calm as the plane continued its journey over the Atlantic. Some passengers were already drifting into light sleep, while others read quietly or stared out into the darkening sky. Gabriel Sinclair sat in his seat, his hands resting on the armrests, his breathing steady. The moments of unease earlier had left him reflective, not unsettled, though he remained aware of the atmosphere around him. He pressed the call button. A simple request, one he had made countless times before on flights like this. Claudia appeared almost immediately, her expression tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned over slightly, her movements precise but lacking the natural warmth expected of someone in her role. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone bordering on sharp. "Just some water, please," Gabriel said evenly, his voice calm, as though trying to preempt any unnecessary escalation. Claudia paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then, with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes, she turned to fetch the drink. Gabriel watched her walk away, the tension in her shoulders visible even from his seat. He glanced at the other passengers around him, some of whom were also watching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. When Claudia returned, she leaned in closer than was necessary. Her voice dropped to a low whisper, audible only to him. "People like you," she said, her words deliberate, "should know better than to make demands." Gabriel froze. The words landed softly but carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his expression calm but his mind processing the implications. He had heard phrases like this before, not always spoken so directly, but always with the same underlying intent. It wasn't about the water. It wasn't even about him. Really, it was about what he represented to people like Claudia. "Excuse me?" he said finally, his voice steady, though there was a slight edge to his tone now. Claudia didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back, her eyes flashing with something that bordered on triumph. Then, before Gabriel could say another word, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sound was sharp, cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The soft rustle of magazines and the clinking of glasses ceased. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence, as though the entire plane had been momentarily suspended in time. Gabriel didn't move. His head had turned slightly from the force of the slap, but his body remained still. Slowly, he lifted a hand to his cheek, the sting vivid but secondary to the overwhelming sense of disbelief. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the cabin on him. A collective moment of shock shared by dozens of people who had no idea how to react. Claudia stood there, her chest heaving, her face flushed with emotion. Whatever restraint she might have possessed earlier was gone now, replaced by something raw and unfiltered. For her, this was no longer about protocol or rules. It was something much deeper. Something that had simmered beneath the surface and finally erupted. Gabriel turned to face her fully, his expression calm but unyielding. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the moment to settle. When he finally did, his voice was measured, almost quiet, but it carried an unmistakable weight. "You've just shown the world exactly who you are," he said. The words weren't angry, but they cut through the tension like a blade, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The cabin remained silent, save for the faint sound of someone fumbling with their phone to start recording. Nearby passengers stared, their faces a mixture of outrage and disbelief. A man across the aisle shook his head slowly, while a woman in the row ahead covered her mouth with her hand. The commotion had drawn the attention of the pilot, who emerged from the cockpit with a look of confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes darting between Gabriel and Claudia. Before anyone could respond, Gabriel rose from his seat. He stood tall, his presence commanding without needing to raise his voice or make any exaggerated gestures. He turned to address the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the passengers who were now fully engaged in the unfolding drama. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone calm but firm. "My name is Gabriel Sinclair. Some of you may know me, many of you likely don't. But what just happened here isn't about me. This is about something far bigger. It's about the way people are treated, the assumptions made, the lines drawn, the unspoken rules that continue to divide us." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence in the cabin was palpable, heavy with the weight of collective awareness. "This isn't just my experience," he continued, It's a reflection of something far too common. Something that needs to change. And I won't let it go unnoticed. With that, he retrieved his phone from his pocket and made a single call. His voice was steady, his instructions clear. By the time the plane landed in Nice, the world would know what had happened aboard Flight 293. Claudia's face had turned pale. The bravado she had displayed moments earlier was now replaced by something closer to fear. She stepped back, her eyes darting nervously toward the other passengers. But no one came to her defense. For once, silence wasn't complicity, it was acknowledgement. As Gabriel sat back down, the cabin began to stir again. Whispers spread among the passengers, their tones low but urgent. Phones buzzed with activity as word of the incident began to spread. Gabriel closed his eyes briefly. Not to rest, but to steady himself for what would come next. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The plane touched down in Nice under a cloudless sky, its wheels gliding smoothly onto the tarmac. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy, thickened by the weight of what had occurred. Conversations were hushed, fragments of murmured words breaking the uneasy silence as passengers exchanged glances. For many, it was the kind of moment that would linger in their minds long after the journey was over, a reminder of the quiet injustices that could erupt into something undeniable. Gabriel Sinclair sat in his seat, composed but deeply reflective. His cheeks still bore the faint warmth of Claudia's slap. But it wasn't the physical sting that lingered. It was the deeper wound. The kind that came not from a single act but from a lifetime of similar moments. He had long understood that success didn't insulate him from prejudice. It merely placed him in rooms where it wore a more polished disguise. As the plane taxied to the gate, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. He announced their arrival with the usual pleasantries, though his tone betrayed a subtle tension. Gabriel suspected that word of the incident had already spread among the crew. It always did. Stories like these had a way of traveling faster than the plane itself. When the doors finally opened, Gabriel rose to collect his belongings. His movements deliberate. The other passengers remained seated, their eyes following him as he stepped into the aisle. He didn't acknowledge the stares, though he could feel their weight. There were no accusations in those gazes. Only curiosity, concern, and perhaps a touch of guilt for having witnessed something they couldn't or wouldn't stop. At the front of the plane, two airline representatives stood waiting. Their postures were stiff, their expressions carefully neutral. Gabriel recognized the practiced professionalism, the kind of demeanor meant to diffuse tension without acknowledging fault. Mr. Sinclair, one of them began, his voice measured but cautious. We'd like to personally escort you through the terminal and ensure that your concerns are addressed promptly. Gabriel met his gaze with a calm intensity. I'm sure you will, he said, his tone free of malice but not devoid of meaning. Behind him, Claudia emerged from the galley, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously around the cabin. Gone was the composed arrogance she had displayed earlier. In its place was something almost pitiable, a woman grappling with the realization that her actions had consequences. Gabriel watched as she was quietly approached by another airline employee, who spoke to her in low, urgent tones. Whatever they said, it caused her to lower her gaze and follow them out of the cabin. Her earlier confidence reduced to silence. As Gabriel stepped into the terminal, he was met by a flurry of activity. Cameras clicked, and reporters murmured among themselves, their curiosity piqued by the whispers of an incident aboard the flight. Gabriel moved past them with the same quiet grace he had carried throughout his life. His expression composed, his stride measured. He had no intention of speaking, not yet. There would be a time and place for that. And it wasn't here, in the chaos of arrivals. Outside, a sleek black car awaited him. Vanessa Hart, his lawyer and longtime confidant, stood nearby, her phone pressed to her ear. She ended the call as he approached, her sharp eyes scanning his face for signs of distress. Are you all right? She asked, her voice low. I'm fine, Gabriel replied. But this isn't over. Vanessa nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She handed him a tablet, the screen already filled with notifications and messages. Videos of the slap had gone viral, the footage capturing not just the act but Gabriel's calm response. The accompanying hashtags spoke of accountability, of systemic change, of the need for conversations long avoided. They're already reaching out, Vanessa said as they climbed into the car. The airline's legal team wants to meet. Their PR department is scrambling to contain this. Gabriel glanced at the screen. His expression unreadable. Let them scramble, he said. We're not negotiating. The car pulled away, the city of Nice unfolding before them in golden hues. Gabriel looked out at the Mediterranean, its tranquil surface a sharp contrast to the storm that had begun to gather. In the distance, his estate awaited, a sanctuary of quiet elegance where his team had already begun preparing for what would come next. Vanessa, he said, breaking the silence, I want everything. The airline's policies, her employment history, their record of handling complaints like this. If there's a pattern, we're exposing it. Vanessa nodded, making notes on her tablet. We've already started digging. Early reports suggest there are prior complaints, at least 3 against Claudia. 2 of them were from employees. The airline dismissed them, citing lack of evidence. Gabriel's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm. So, this isn't just about her. It's about a system that protects people like her. Exactly, Vanessa replied. And we can argue systemic negligence, maybe even complicity. Gabriel turned his gaze back to the horizon. The faint lines of determination etched into his features. Then we're not just holding her accountable. We're holding them all accountable. As the car sped along the coast, Gabriel felt the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice. But it would be the first time he would address it on such a scale. He wasn't seeking retribution, he never had. What he sought was change. The kind that wouldn't just make headlines but would ripple outward, shifting the currents of a society too often resistant to them. The waves crashed against the shore, their rhythm steady and unyielding. Gabriel watched them, his thoughts as calm and deliberate as the ocean before him. This wasn't just a fight for himself, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in a world that should have been big enough for them all. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of Gabriel Sinclair's estate, painting the room in soft hues of gold. The space was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of paper or the faint tapping of a keyboard. Gabriel sat at the head of a long table, his posture relaxed but his focus sharp. Around him, his team worked in measured silence, each absorbed in the task at hand. On the wall, a series of screens displayed everything from social media analytics to news headlines. The story of Flight 293 was dominating the airwaves. The video of Claudia's slap had become a symbol, not just of an isolated incident, but of something much larger, a cultural reckoning that many had long avoided. Vanessa Hart entered the room, a stack of documents in hand. Her expression was serious but tinged with quiet triumph, as though she had uncovered something significant. Gabriel, she began, setting the papers down in front of him. We've found more. He glanced up, his eyes meeting hers with steady curiosity. Go on. Vanessa flipped through the documents, her fingers pausing on a page. Claudia has a history: 3 formal complaints over the past 5 years. 2 from colleagues, 1 from a passenger, all alleged discriminatory behavior. The language is vague, but the patterns are clear. In each case, the airline dismissed the claims, citing insufficient evidence. Gabriel's expression didn't change, but there was a tightening in his jaw, a subtle indication of his thoughts. And the airline? They have a track record too. Vanessa continued. We found internal documents suggesting a broader issue: complaints from employees of color about a hostile work environment. Some involving Claudia directly. The airline buried them, choosing instead to protect their image. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. So, this isn't just about her. It's systemic. Vanessa nodded. Exactly. If we can prove this pattern of negligence, it strengthens our case. This isn't just about one incident, it's about a culture that enables behavior like hers. Gabriel let the weight of her words settle over the room. It wasn't surprising, he had expected as much, but seeing it laid out so clearly was sobering. This wasn't just a personal fight, it was a window into something far more pervasive. Have you contacted the others? He asked finally, his voice calm but deliberate. We're reaching out now, Vanessa replied. The former employees, the passengers who filed complaints. If they're willing to come forward, it could be a game changer. Gabriel nodded, his mind already moving to the next steps. He knew what this would mean not just for him, but for those who had stayed silent out of fear or exhaustion. It was one thing to face an individual, but to challenge an institution required a different kind of courage. The door to the room opened, and another team member stepped in, holding a phone. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, her tone respectful but urgent. "We have someone on the line. A former flight attendant who worked with Claudia. She says she has information." Gabriel gestured for the phone, his movements unhurried but purposeful. He placed it to his ear, his voice steady as he spoke. "This is Gabriel Sinclair. I understand you have something to share." The voice on the other end was hesitant at first. A woman who sounded cautious but resolute. She introduced herself, explaining that she had worked for the airline for several years before resigning. Her time there, she said, had been marked by subtle but persistent discrimination, much of it overlooked or dismissed by management. "It wasn't just Claudia," the woman said, her voice tinged with quiet frustration. "She was one of many. But the thing is, the airline knew. They always knew. They just didn't care." Gabriel listened without interrupting, his silence encouraging her to continue. She described incidents of favoritism, unequal treatment, and a culture that prioritized appearances over accountability. By the time she finished, the room had fallen into a profound stillness, each team member absorbing the weight of her words. "Thank you for speaking up," Gabriel said finally, his voice warm but firm. "Your courage will make a difference." After the call ended, he set the phone down and looked at his team. "This isn't just about filing a lawsuit," he said. "This is about giving a voice to people who've been silenced for too long." The room seemed to come alive with renewed energy. Vanessa began outlining their legal strategy, while others worked on compiling the evidence into a coherent narrative. Gabriel observed it all, his presence a steady anchor amidst the activity. As the day wore on, the enormity of their task became clear. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about challenging an entrenched system. One that relied on apathy and complicity to maintain its hold. Gabriel knew the risks, the resistance they would face. But he also knew the importance of pressing forward. By evening, the team had made significant progress. Vanessa approached him with an update, her expression both serious and hopeful. "We've heard back from one of the former employees. She's willing to testify, and we've identified gaps in the airline's policies that could bolster our argument." Gabriel nodded, his gaze distant as he processed the information. "Good. Let's make sure we're thorough. They'll try to discredit us, so we need to be prepared." As the team began to wind down for the night, Gabriel stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the Mediterranean. The sea stretched endlessly before him, its surface calm and reflective. He stood there for a long moment, the cool breeze brushing against his face. This wasn't a fight he had sought, but it was one he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about righting a wrong, it was about shifting a narrative. About forcing people to confront the quiet injustices they so often chose to overlook. As the waves lapped gently against the shore, Gabriel felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But he was ready. Change, after all, didn't come from the easy moments. It came from the difficult ones. The moments that tested resolve and demanded action. And Gabriel Sinclair was nothing if not resolute. The morning sun cast long shadows over the courtyard of Gabriel Sinclair's estate in Monaco. The scene was serene, the Mediterranean shimmering in the distance. But the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Journalists and camera crews gathered on the stone steps leading to the grand entrance. Their voices a low hum of murmured speculation. They had come not for spectacle, but for answers. Inside, Gabriel stood before a mirror, adjusting the crisp collar of his white shirt. His gray blazer hung neatly on his shoulders, the image of understated elegance. Vanessa Hart stood nearby, a tablet in hand, her expression calm but focused. "They're waiting," she said softly, breaking the silence. Gabriel turned to her, meeting her gaze. "Then let's give them something worth waiting for." He stepped out onto the stone steps, the crowd falling silent at the sight of him. The weight of his presence, calm yet commanding, seemed to settle over the gathered press. Cameras clicked, their shutters echoing in the still air, capturing the image of a man who had come not to plead, but to lead. Gabriel began speaking, his voice steady and measured, carrying the same quiet power that had defined him throughout his life. What happened on Flight 293, he said, was more than an isolated incident. It was a reminder, a stark and painful one, of the prejudice that persists in our society. Prejudice that doesn't always wear a blatant face, but exists in subtler, insidious forms. It lingers in the assumptions we make, the biases we deny, and the systems that too often protect those biases. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. The quiet was profound, the kind that demanded attention rather than spectacle. This isn't just about me, he continued. It's about everyone who has ever been judged, dismissed, or devalued because of who they are. It's about the passengers on that flight who witnessed something they didn't know how to stop. It's about the employees who filed complaints and were ignored. And it's about a system that prioritizes protecting its image over protecting its people. Gabriel's tone remained calm, but his words carried a quiet intensity. He wasn't speaking for effect, he was speaking for change. I've filed a formal lawsuit against the airline, he said, his voice firm but not harsh. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. This isn't just about accountability for one person's actions, it's about accountability for a culture that allowed those actions to go unchecked. And let me be clear, any proceeds from this case will go to organizations dedicated to fighting systemic racism and creating spaces where people are valued for who they are, not judged for what they look like. The crowd erupted in questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of urgency. But Gabriel raised a hand, his gesture quieting them almost immediately. I've also filed a motion, he added, his tone unwavering, to release the airline's internal records related to complaints of discrimination. If there is a pattern, if there are other voices that have been silenced, it's time for those stories to come to light. The truth deserves to be heard, and those responsible must be held accountable. Behind the cameras, the murmurs grew louder. Journalists exchanged glances, sensing the gravity of the moment. This was no ordinary press conference, it was a declaration of intent. A commitment to something far greater than a single incident. Gabriel's expression softened slightly as he concluded. I'm not doing this for retribution. I'm doing it because we cannot continue to allow these quiet injustices to persist. Change doesn't happen by itself. It happens when we choose to confront what's uncomfortable, what's inconvenient, and what's long overdue. With that, he stepped back, his message delivered. The questions resumed almost immediately, reporters clamoring for more details. But Gabriel had said all he needed to say. Vanessa gestured for the press conference to end, guiding him back inside as the crowd's voices swirled behind them. Inside, the estate was quiet again, the energy of the moment lingering in the stillness. Gabriel sat down in a leather armchair, his posture relaxed but his mind clearly at work. Vanessa approached, her tablet now tucked under her arm. They'll be talking about this for weeks, she said, her tone neutral but with a trace of satisfaction. That's the point, Gabriel replied. This can't just be a headline. It has to be a conversation. A real one. Vanessa nodded, understanding the weight of his words. We've already started receiving inquiries from other former employees, people who saw the press conference and want to come forward. And the airline's legal team is scrambling. They've issued a preliminary statement. But it's underwhelming. Gabriel smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Let them scramble. This isn't just their reckoning. It's a chance for everyone to see what needs to change. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the distant sound of the sea filling the space. Gabriel's thoughts drifted, not to what had happened, but to what lay ahead. This wasn't a fight he had sought, but it was one he would see through, not for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt the quiet weight of prejudice and chose to stand anyway. Outside, the press began to disperse, their voices carrying fragments of a story that was no longer just Gabriel's. It belonged to the world now. A call for change that had only just begun. And Gabriel Sinclair, steady as the tide, was ready to lead the way. The weeks that followed the press conference moved with a quiet yet relentless momentum. Gabriel Sinclair watched as the world began to take notice of the story that had started on Flight 293. What had once been a single, isolated event had grown into a broader conversation. One that extended far beyond the confines of an airline cabin. The airline's initial response had been measured but ultimately inadequate. Their carefully worded statement expressed regret for the unfortunate incident, and affirmed their commitment to diversity and inclusion. For Gabriel, the words rang hollow, a reflexive attempt to control damage without confronting the deeper truths. The airline's problems were no longer contained. Former employees and passengers came forward, each with their own story of unfair treatment, subtle exclusions, and, in some cases, outright discrimination. Gabriel's legal team had been inundated with messages, some from those who had suffered quietly, others from those who had long since moved on but felt compelled to speak now. One evening, as Gabriel sat in his study overlooking the Mediterranean, Vanessa Hart entered with a thick folder of documents. She placed it on the desk in front of him, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "We've uncovered more," she said, sitting down across from him. 3 additional complaints, all involving Claudia. 2 were from passengers, 1 was from a former employee. The airline dismissed all of them, citing insufficient evidence. Sound familiar? Gabriel picked up the folder, flipping through the pages. Each document told a story, a subtle slight, a moment of dismissal, an apology that never felt sincere. The patterns were unmistakable, and they painted a picture not of isolated incidents, but of a system that had turned a blind eye for far too long. "It's not just about her," Vanessa continued. "This is systemic. The airline didn't just fail to act, they actively buried these complaints. They prioritized their reputation over accountability." Gabriel set the folder down, his fingers tracing the edge of the papers. "And now it's catching up with them." Vanessa nodded. "We've already started compiling everything for the case. Between the complaints, the video, and the testimonies we've gathered, they're going to have a hard time defending themselves." As Gabriel listened, his gaze drifted to the window, where the waves rolled steadily against the shore. He thought about the people who had reached out, their voices tentative but determined, their stories carrying the same quiet weight as his own. For many of them, this wasn't just about an airline or a single flight attendant. It was about being seen, about having their experiences validated in a world that often refused to acknowledge them. The momentum of the case began to build, drawing attention from media outlets, advocacy groups, and even government officials. The airline's stock plummeted as investors pulled out, unwilling to be associated with the growing scandal. Inside their corporate offices, executives scrambled to contain the fallout. But the damage was already done. One morning, Gabriel's phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "Claudia charged with assault." Evidence found in emails. Gabriel opened the attached file and scanned the contents. The emails were damning messages in which Claudia mocked passengers of color, referred to them as entitled, and made derogatory remarks about colleagues. The tone was casual, almost flippant, as though she had never considered the possibility of consequences. Gabriel's reaction was muted. He felt no satisfaction, only a quiet resolve. The emails were a confirmation of what he already knew, that this wasn't just about one person's actions, but about a culture that had allowed those actions to thrive unchecked. Later that day, Vanessa arrived with more updates. "The airline's legal team has reached out," she said. "They want to settle. The offer is substantial enough to end this quickly and quietly." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, considering her words. He understood the temptation. Settling would be easier, less disruptive, but easy solutions rarely led to meaningful change. "No," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "We're not settling. This isn't about the money. It's about accountability." Vanessa nodded, her respect for his decision evident. "Then we move forward. Their CEO is scheduled to testify next week. We'll make sure the questions focus on their policies or lack thereof." As the days turned into weeks, Gabriel remained steadfast. He attended hearings, spoke with reporters, and worked tirelessly with his team to ensure that the case wasn't just about winning, but about creating a ripple effect. His actions inspired others to examine their own roles in systems of inequality, sparking conversations that were long overdue. One evening, as Gabriel stood on the balcony of his estate, he reflected on how far they had come. The waves below were calm, their rhythm steady and unchanging. A reminder that progress often mirrored the ocean, slow, deliberate, but ultimately unstoppable. Vanessa joined him, a glass of water in her hand. "We've already made history," she said quietly, "but I think this is only the beginning." Gabriel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is," he said, "and we're ready for whatever comes next." Together, they stood in silence, the world around them continuing to turn. For Gabriel, this wasn't just about seeking justice, it was about creating a legacy of change. One that would outlast him and inspire others to do the same. And in that quiet moment, beneath the vast expanse of the sky, he felt a sense of peace, knowing he was exactly where he needed to be. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Gabriel Sinclair sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression calm, his presence steady. To an outsider, he might have appeared detached. But those who knew him understood the depth of his resolve. He wasn't here for spectacle or revenge, he was here for something much larger than himself. Across the room, the airline's executives sat stiffly, their lawyers shuffling papers and whispering amongst themselves. The weight of public scrutiny had taken its toll. Their carefully curated image of inclusivity and professionalism had been shattered, replaced by a narrative they could no longer control. As the judge entered, the room rose to its feet. Gabriel followed suit, his movements deliberate, his gaze unwavering. This was the culmination of months of preparation, countless late nights, and a lifetime of enduring the quiet weight of prejudice. But as the proceedings began, he felt none of the anger or bitterness that might have consumed another man in his position. Instead, he felt clarity, a sense of purpose that anchored him. The case unfolded with the same quiet intensity that had characterized Gabriel's approach from the beginning. Vanessa Hart presented their evidence methodically, her voice steady as she outlined the airline's pattern of negligence. The emails, the buried complaints, the testimonies from former employees and passengers, they all painted a picture too vivid to ignore. When Gabriel took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. His voice was measured as he recounted the events of Flight 293. His words free of embellishment but rich with meaning. "This isn't just about what happened to me," he said, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "It's about a culture that allowed it to happen, a culture that dismissed complaints, silenced voices, and chose convenience over accountability. That's what needs to change." His testimony was brief but powerful. It wasn't just the words he spoke, but the way he spoke them with a calm resolve that made it impossible to look away. By the time he stepped down, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The airline's defense team scrambled to regain control, but their arguments felt hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence. When the verdict came, it wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. The court found the airline liable, not only for Claudia's actions but for the systemic failures that had enabled them. The damages awarded were substantial, but Gabriel had already decided they wouldn't line his pockets. Every cent would go toward creating lasting change. In the days that followed, the headlines were filled with stories of accountability and justice. Gabriel's decision to establish the Sinclair Foundation for Equity in Travel became a rallying cry, a symbol of what could be achieved when determination met purpose. The foundation's mission was clear: to advocate for anti-discrimination policies across the travel industry and to ensure that no one would face what he had endured without recourse. The airline, now under intense scrutiny, announced sweeping changes. They promised to overhaul their training programs, reevaluate their policies, and establish an independent review board for complaints. For Gabriel, these steps were a start, not a resolution, but a recognition that the path forward required action, not words. One evening, Gabriel sat on the terrace of his estate, the sea stretching endlessly before him. Vanessa joined him, her tablet in hand. "As always, they're calling it a turning point," she said, glancing at the screen. "The media, the advocacy groups, they're saying this could set a precedent for how corporations address systemic bias." Gabriel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's a step," he said quietly, "but the work doesn't end here." Vanessa smiled faintly. "It never does." They sat in companionable silence, the waves below echoing the rhythm of their thoughts. For Gabriel, the journey wasn't about erasing the past, it was about shaping the future. He had always known that change wouldn't come easily. But as he looked out at the vast expanse of the sea, he felt a quiet confidence that it would come nonetheless. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unvalued. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, Gabriel allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that he had done his part to make the world a little brighter for those who would come after him.